The text message came in at 11:42 on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of helping a patron find a book on home canning. My phone buzzed against the reference desk, and I glanced down out of habit. One line from my brother. Dropped Ethan at your place. Door was unlocked, so I let him in. He knows where the spare key is anyway. I read it 3 times. Then I excused myself, walked to the back room, and called Daniel's number. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called again. Same thing. I grabbed my coat, told my colleague Sandra that I had a family emergency, and drove the 20 minutes home with my hands tight on the wheel, the whole way. Ethan was sitting on my porch steps when I pulled into the driveway. He hadn't gone inside. He was 8 years old, wearing a thin jacket that wasn't nearly warm enough for an October afternoon in Ohio, and he had his backpack hugged to his chest like it was the only solid thing in the world. When he saw my car, he looked up, and the expression on his face, this careful, practiced blankness that no 8-year-old should know how to wear, cracked just slightly at the edges. "Hey, buddy," I said, and I kept my voice steady, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. "Hi, Aunt Rebecca," he said. "I didn't want to go inside without you." I pulled him into a hug right there on the porch, backpack and all. He was stiff for a second, the way he always was, like he'd learned that affection came with conditions. Then he leaned in. That was the moment everything changed. "I just didn't know it yet. I need to back up so you understand how we got here, because none of this happened overnight. My brother Daniel is 44 years old and has spent roughly 42 of those years being the most important person in any room he walks into, at least in his own estimation. Growing up, Daniel was the athlete, state champion wrestler at 17, full scholarship to Ohio State, the kind of guy whose high school trophies are still displayed in a glass case at our parents' house, even though our parents have been gone for 6 years. I am 4 years younger than Daniel, and I spent most of my childhood watching adults light up when he walked in and then smile politely when they remembered I was there too. I don't say this with bitterness. It's just the truth. Daniel was extraordinary at the things our culture rewards loudly. I was ordinary at the things our culture rewards quietly. I became a librarian. I read a lot. I make a good chicken pot pie, and I know where to find almost any book ever written. Daniel became a regional manager for a sporting goods chain and coached youth football on the weekends and had an opinion about everything. He married a woman named Gwen when he was 32. Gwen was pretty and thin and laughed at all of Daniel's jokes and had no visible opinions of her own, which I think was part of her appeal to him. Their first son, Connor, was born 11 months after the wedding. Connor was, from the moment he could walk, everything Daniel had ever wanted in a child. Fast, competitive, fearless. By age 10, he was playing travel baseball and youth football simultaneously, and Daniel drove 3 hours each way to tournaments without complaint. Connor's schedule was on a whiteboard in their kitchen. There were color-coded columns. Ethan came along 4 years later. And Ethan was Ethan was gentle. Ethan liked to sit quietly and draw elaborate maps of imaginary countries. He taught himself to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on Gwen's old keyboard by ear when he was 5. He cried at sad movies and asked careful, thoughtful questions about things adults usually brushed past. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of child who would have been my favorite person in any room. He was exactly the kind of child who made Daniel visibly uncomfortable. I noticed it the first Thanksgiving after Ethan started talking in full sentences. Daniel was telling a story about Connor's last football game, a story he had already told twice that day, and Ethan tugged on his sleeve and said, "Daddy, did you know that blue whales have hearts as big as a small car?" Daniel looked down at him with this flat expression, the kind you give to a mildly annoying stranger, said, "That's interesting, buddy," and turned back to his story. Ethan watched him for a moment, then quietly picked up a crayon from the table and went back to his drawing. I watched that and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Over the next 2 years, it became a pattern I couldn't unsee once I'd seen it. Connor's wins got celebrations. Ethan's achievements, a drawing praised by his teacher, a spelling bee ribbon. The moment he played an actual melody on that keyboard, entirely by himself, got a nod, maybe a good job, and then Daniel's attention moved immediately back to Connor. At birthday dinners, Daniel would spend the drive home recapping Connor's recent sports highlights for the benefit of whoever was in the car. At family gatherings, Ethan drifted to the edges. He learned to occupy himself. He learned to be small. I started making a point of sitting with Ethan at family events. We'd end up in corners together, and he'd show me his drawings, and I'd ask him about his imaginary countries. They had names and capitals and histories, and he remembered every detail, and he'd get this look on his face. This lit-up, careful look, like he was deciding whether it was safe to be enthusiastic about something. Usually he'd decide yes, with me. That felt important. I said something to Daniel about it once. Just once, because once was enough to understand how that conversation would always end. We were at my house for Easter, and Ethan had spent the afternoon helping me in the kitchen. He loved being in the kitchen, loved the measuring and the timing and the particular science of it, and he'd done a genuinely impressive job decorating the cake. I said to Daniel, casually, Ethan's got a real eye for detail. You should see what he can do when he puts his mind to something. Daniel looked at Ethan across the room, then back at me. He needs to find a sport, he said. I've tried him on everything. Baseball, soccer, swimming. He just doesn't have the drive. I don't know where he gets it from. He said it like Ethan wasn't 8 feet away, like this was a neutral observation about a slightly defective appliance. He doesn't have to have the drive for sports, I said. He has drive for other things. Daniel looked at me the way he always looked at me when he thought I was being naive. Rebecca, drive is drive. If a kid won't compete, won't push himself, won't get back up when he loses, that's a character issue. I'm trying to build his character. I thought about Ethan on that porch with his backpack. 2 years later. I thought about how much character building a child can absorb before it starts doing damage instead of good. The drop-offs started small. Daniel and Gwen had Connor's travel baseball tournaments most weekends, and Ethan didn't play baseball. At first they'd ask, and I'd say yes, and Ethan and I would have genuinely good weekends. We'd go to the library, cook elaborate dinners, listen to music. He started asking if we could listen to piano pieces on YouTube and then trying to replicate them on the small keyboard I bought at a garage sale for $12 after he mentioned 3 times in one conversation that he wished he could practice more. Then the asking stopped. Daniel would send a text the morning of, sometimes the night before, dropping Ethan at 9. Okay, not a question. I always said yes. I said yes because Ethan's face when he arrived had this quality to it, relief. Almost, a releasing of something he'd been holding, and I wasn't willing to be the reason he didn't get to have that. But I talked to Daniel about it twice more. I said it wasn't fair to Ethan to be treated like a scheduling problem. Daniel said Ethan was fine, that I was coddling him, that letting him spend every weekend drawing and playing around on a keyboard was making it worse. He needs to be around kids his own age, not hanging out with his aunt, Daniel said, which stung more than he probably intended. Gwen said nothing. Gwen was very good at saying nothing. My mother, before she passed, used to say that some people mistake motion for progress. Daniel was always in motion, but watching Ethan, watching the careful way he navigated a house where his own father seemed to find him disappointing, I wasn't sure any progress was happening at all. The Tuesday in October was different from the other drop-offs in one specific way. Daniel hadn't asked. He'd simply done it, and he'd sent one text and turned off his phone. I found out later from Gwen, who called me that evening sounding strained and apologetic, that Connor had been recruited to a week-long elite baseball camp in Tennessee, and Daniel had driven him down that morning, and the camp ran Monday through Sunday, and they had decided that Ethan would just stay with me for the week. They had made this decision sometime over the weekend. They had not mentioned it to me. They had not mentioned it to Ethan either, based on the look on his face when I asked him how long he was staying. Dad said you'd know, Ethan said, staring at his soup. I kept my voice even. Well, I'm glad you're here regardless. We'll figure it out. He looked up at me then, this careful, measuring look. Are you actually glad? Or are you just saying that? 8 years old. 8 years old, and already fluent in the language of adults who say things they don't mean. I am actually glad, I said. I have been actually glad every single time you've come here. That is the truth. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and went back to his soup. He stayed the week. By Wednesday, he had reorganized my bookshelf by color and then by subject and explained his system to me in detail. By Thursday, he had picked out a piano melody I didn't recognize and told me it was something he'd made up himself, and I sat at the kitchen table and listened to him play it 3 times in a row, because the first time through I was too stunned to pay full attention. By Friday, I had called my friend Patricia, who gave piano lessons out of her home studio, and asked if she'd be willing to listen to Ethan play something. Patricia's response, after Ethan played her his composition over the phone with the keyboard pressed up against the receiver, was a long silence followed by, "Rebecca, how has no one put this child in lessons yet?" Daniel came back Sunday. He texted. Same pattern. On our way. Be there around 4. No apology. No acknowledgement that leaving an 8-year-old for a week without a conversation was unusual. When he arrived, Connor came through the door first, sunburned and talking loudly about his hitting stats from the camp. Daniel was right behind him, full of energy, wanting to tell me every detail of Connor's week. Ethan stood up from the couch where he'd been reading, and Daniel said, "Hey, bud, get your stuff," without looking at him. "Daniel," I said, "can we talk for a minute?" We stood in my kitchen while Gwen helped Ethan find his jacket, and I told Daniel that this couldn't keep happening. That Ethan needed to be told in advance, that I needed to be asked, not informed, and that more than any of that, Ethan needed to feel like his family wanted him around, not like they were arranging storage for the week. Daniel crossed his arms. "He's fine, Rebecca. He loves being here. You just said he had a great week." He did have a great week. That's not the point. Then what's the point? You want me to apologize for letting him stay with his favorite person. He'd rather be here than at a camp that doesn't interest him. I'm doing him a favor. The favor would be paying attention to what does interest him. Did you know he wrote a song this week? He played it on the keyboard and it was Rebecca. Daniel's voice had that tone. The patient explaining to a child tone. I know you think the keyboard stuff is cute, but I have 2 sons, and I'm trying to raise them to be capable, competitive men. One of them has a real shot at a future in athletics. The other one, I love Ethan. You know I do, but I can't build his whole life around a hobby. It's not a hobby. It's who he is. Daniel shook his head like I'd said something sad and misguided, and went to get Ethan's bag. I stood in my kitchen after they left, and felt the specific frustration of having said the true thing perfectly clearly, and having it make absolutely no difference. 3 more months of the same. Drop-offs with less and less notice. A weekend here, 4 days there. I started keeping Ethan's favorite cereal in my pantry. I started leaving his toothbrush in the guest bathroom instead of putting it away. Patricia agreed to give Ethan informal lessons on the weekends he was with me, and within 6 weeks, she pulled me aside after a session and said, I want you to understand what I'm telling you. This child is genuinely gifted. We're talking about a real ear, real instinct, real musicality. This doesn't come along often, I told Daniel. I sent him a voice message. I wanted him to hear the seriousness in my voice, explaining what Patricia had said, suggesting he look into music programs in their school district, asking if he'd be willing to let Ethan take regular lessons. He replied with a text. Thanks for the update. I'll look into it. He did not look into it. The morning everything broke open was a Saturday in February. I had plans. Not important plans, a hair appointment, coffee with a friend, genuinely minor things, but they were my plans on my day. At 7:45 in the morning, my phone buzzed, dropping Ethan off at 8. Connor has a showcase. It's a big one. You don't mind, right? I called Daniel immediately. I do mind, I said, because you're asking me at 7:45 for an 8 o'clock drop-off, and I have plans today. Rebecca, this is Connor's biggest showcase of the year. College scouts are going to be there. Connor is 12. It's never too early to build a profile. Come on. Ethan loves being with you. Daniel, that is not the point, and you know it. The point is that Ethan is your son too, and you keep treating him like a problem to be solved whenever Connor needs your attention. There was a pause. Then, I don't have time for this right now. I'll have Gwen drop him in 20 minutes. He hung up. Gwen dropped him off. She looked at me with an expression that was either apology or exhaustion. I was never sure which, with Gwen, and said he's been a little quiet this morning before getting back in the car. Ethan stood on my doorstep with his backpack. He was 9 now. His birthday had been in November, which Daniel and Gwen had celebrated by taking Connor to a football playoff game that happened to fall on the same day. My gift to Ethan had been a proper keyboard with weighted keys, which Patricia had helped me pick out, and he had cried quietly when he unwrapped it. The good kind of crying, which was somehow worse. Did they tell you where they were going? I asked. Connor's showcase, Ethan said. It's a big one. College Scouts. He repeated his father's words exactly, in his father's inflection, with none of his father's excitement. I looked at this 9-year-old boy on my doorstep in February, understanding perfectly that he had learned not to expect to matter as much as his brother, had built his whole interior world, the maps, the music, the careful questions in the space his family left unoccupied, and I made a decision that I had probably been moving toward for 2 years, without letting myself name it. Come inside, I said, and then I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, okay? Not the answer you think I want. The real one. He came inside. We sat at the kitchen table with hot chocolate, and I said, if you could do anything with your music lessons, a program, anything, what would you want? He stared into his mug for a long time. Then, there's a junior conservatory program at Worthington Arts Academy. My music teacher at school told me about it. She said she'd help me apply. He paused. I didn't tell my dad. Why not? Because he'd say it was a waste of time. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. It is not a waste of time, I said. Can I talk to your music teacher? He looked up, that careful measuring look. Then, slowly, the look changed into something I hadn't seen on his face before. Something open. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. I won't pretend the next steps were simple. I called his music teacher. Her name was Miss Aldridge, and she had clearly been waiting for someone to make this call for a year. I spoke with Patricia, who offered to write a recommendation. I called Daniel and told him about the program, explained the application process, explained that Miss Aldridge believed Ethan was a serious candidate. Rebecca, a junior conservatory program is incredibly demanding, Daniel said. It would eat up all his free time. I'm not sure that's good for a kid who already doesn't do enough outside of. Outside of what, Daniel? Being with me? Because those are the only times he gets to do the things he's actually good at. I'm not doing this with you right now. I'll cover the application fees, I said. I'll drive him to auditions. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm asking you to say yes. A pause. Then, in the tone of a man doing a small, annoying person, a small, annoying favor. Fine. If it makes you both happy, just don't be upset when he doesn't get in. Ethan got in. He didn't just get in. He was accepted with a partial scholarship, which the program awarded to 7 students, out of over 200 applicants. Miss Aldridge called me, not Daniel, to tell me, and her voice was shaking with excitement. I sat in my car in a parking lot and cried for about 4 minutes, then pulled myself together and went home to tell Ethan. He was at my kitchen table, another weekend drop-off, another showcase for Connor working on a new composition in his notebook. I walked in and set the acceptance letter in front of him without saying anything. He read it once, then again. Then he looked up at me, and for the first time in all the years I had known my nephew, he smiled, without checking first, to see if it was allowed. I called Daniel that evening. I described the letter. I described the scholarship. I told him the program started in September, and that Patricia and Miss Aldridge were both prepared to help with transportation and support, and that Ethan was, unambiguously, extraordinary. There was a long silence on Daniel's end. I heard him breathing. A partial scholarship, he said finally. Yes. Out of how many applicants? Over 200. Another pause. That's actually pretty impressive. I know. I didn't know he was that serious about it. I know, I said again, and I kept my voice gentle because I was so tired of being angry. You would have, if you'd been watching. He was quiet for a moment. Then, can I talk to him? I put Ethan on the phone and listened from the next room. I couldn't hear what Daniel said, but I heard Ethan's side of the conversation, the short, careful answers at first. Then slowly, gradually, something loosening. At one point, Ethan laughed. Actually laughed, unguarded and real, and I had to press my hand to my mouth for a moment before I could go back to doing the dishes. I thought that was going to be the end of the hard part. I was wrong. A few weeks later, Gwen called me on a Sunday morning. Her voice was different, not the careful neutrality I was used to. Strained, tight. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to understand I'm not doing this to make trouble. Okay. Daniel has been saying he's been telling people, like his colleagues, his friends from the football league, that he's the one who pushed for the conservatory program, That he always knew Ethan was musically gifted, and he enrolled him himself. A pause. He said it to Connor last week, too, in front of Ethan. The particular cold feeling I'd had in my stomach years ago, watching Daniel overlook Ethan at Thanksgiving, came back fully formed. What did Ethan do? I asked. He didn't say anything. He just looked at his plate. Her voice caught slightly. Rebecca, I know I haven't said enough, for a long time, about how things were, with Ethan. I want you to know I know that. I thought about saying something generous and gracious. Instead, I said, what changed? A long pause. Connor told me. Last month, he said this child. He's 12 years old, he said to me. Mom, I feel like Ethan doesn't exist to Dad unless I'm not around. And I looked at my 12-year-old saying that and I thought, what are we doing? I let the silence sit for a moment. I don't know what to do with what Daniel is telling people, I said finally. But what I care about is Ethan knowing the truth. He knows. Gwen said quietly. He knows exactly what happened and who made it happen. September came. Ethan started at Worthington Arts Academy 3 mornings a week, and the change in him was like watching a plant finally put in proper sunlight. He stood differently. He talked more. He started telling me, in detail, about the other kids in his cohort, about the pieces they were working on, about the theory classes that he described as really hard, but the good kind of hard. He started calling me on weekday evenings sometimes, just to tell me about his day, and I rearranged my whole evening schedule around those calls without once minding. Daniel came to the conservatory's fall showcase, which surprised me. He sat in the 3rd row with Gwen and Connor, and when Ethan walked out and sat down at the piano, I watched Daniel's face from across the aisle. I watched him watch his son. Ethan played for 6 minutes. He played an original composition, something he'd been working on since spring, something complex and patient, and then suddenly, at the end, joyful in a way that made 2 people near me tear up. When he finished, the room was quiet for a beat longer than expected. The way rooms go quiet when something has moved them without warning. The applause was real and long, and Ethan stood at the piano and looked out at the audience with an expression I had never seen on his face before in 9 years, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. I looked at Daniel. He was clapping. His face was doing something complicated pride, I think, and underneath it something harder to name. The look of a person realizing they almost missed something. Afterward, in the lobby, Daniel put his hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "That was something, bud. I mean it." His voice was gruff in the way men's voices get when they're trying not to show they're affected. Ethan looked at him steadily. "Thanks, Dad," he said. Polite, measured, not cold, but not warm either. The voice of a child who had learned to manage his own expectations. That should have been a lesson. I hoped it was. It wasn't. Not completely. 3 months after the showcase, I got a phone call from Daniel on a Friday afternoon. He wanted to talk about Ethan's future. He'd spoken to someone, a colleague whose son had done competitive sports, an agent of some kind, and apparently there was money in performance. In competitions, appearances, that whole world. He'd been reading about child prodigies, about the circuit, about what it would take. "I want to get him a proper manager," Daniel said. "Someone who knows the industry. There's a lot of opportunity there, and right now we're leaving it on the table." I sat very still. "Ethan is 9, I said. "That's actually the right time to start building." "Daniel." I stopped, took a breath, chose my words very carefully. "Ethan is at the conservatory because music is who he is, not a product, not an opportunity. If you walk into his life right now with a manager and a competition schedule, you will do to his music exactly what you did to everything else, turn it into something that's about your expectations instead of his joy. And unlike baseball and soccer, you cannot take music away from him and replace it with another option. It is the only thing keeping him whole." Silence. "That's a harsh thing to say," Daniel said. "I know. I mean it." A longer silence. Then, Gwen said something similar. "Last week, Gwen is right. She's been saying a lot of things lately." His voice shifted, quieter, something resigned underneath it. "Connor told me he doesn't want to play baseball anymore. Did you know that? He wants to try theater. He told me last month and I told him to think about it and he said there was nothing to think about, it was already decided." A pause. I didn't handle that well. I waited. "I keep thinking," Daniel said, and his voice was different now, rougher, less managed. I keep thinking about when Ethan was 5 and he played that keyboard thing by ear, and I remember thinking it was impressive and then just moving on. Not writing it down, not saying anything, just moving on. A pause. I don't know why I did that. I thought about 9 years of accumulated small moments. The dismissed questions, the overlooked drawings, the birthday spent at Connor's game, the February morning in the driveway, the backpack held tight like it was the only solid thing. I think, I said carefully, that you saw something in Ethan that you didn't know how to value. And when we don't know how to value something, we often make the mistake of deciding it isn't valuable. Daniel was quiet for a long time. How do I fix it? He asked. And for the first time in my memory, the question was genuine. You show up, I said, not to manage his career, not to build his profile. You show up because he is your son, and you want to know who he is. You ask him about the imaginary countries. You ask him what he's working on. You sit in the room and listen without having somewhere else to be. He's not going to trust it right away, Daniel said. It wasn't a question. No, I said. He won't. He's learned not to. And you? A pause. Are you going to trust it? I thought about every drop-off, every unanswered call, every conversation that went nowhere, every time I watched Ethan make himself small in a room where he should have been celebrated. I will watch, I said, and I'll be honest with you about what I see. He accepted that. I think, for Daniel, that was probably as much accountability as one phone call could hold. It did not go perfectly from there. Real things don't. Daniel made efforts that fell short, promised things he didn't fully deliver, occasionally defaulted back to old habits and needed to be redirected. Gwen, quietly and consistently, became an ally I hadn't expected. She signed Connor up for a community theater program, attended every single performance, and stopped being quiet in rooms where she should have spoken. Connor, to his enormous credit, turned out to be a genuinely talented actor, and a kid who, freed from the weight of being his father's reflection, was kinder and funnier and more interesting than I'd realized. And Ethan. Ethan grew. He stayed in the conservatory program through 5th grade, won a regional junior composition competition at age 11, cried for 20 minutes in my passenger seat afterward with the trophy in his lap, and then pulled himself together and asked if we could stop for tacos. He taught himself guitar from online tutorials during a summer I spent mostly watching him from the kitchen doorway, marveling at the focused patience of him. He started answering his father's questions more openly, slowly, the way trust returns when it's given room, not quickly, not all at once, but with a realness to it that's different from the performed acceptance of a child who's given up. He still came to my house on weekends, still reorganized my bookshelves, still helped in the kitchen, still told me in great detail about the maps of his imaginary countries, which now had full geopolitical histories and trade agreements and, as of last fall, a functioning government structure that I genuinely found impressive. He called me one evening the spring he turned 12, which he did regularly by then, and at the end of the call said, almost as an aside, "Hey, Aunt Rebecca, I've been thinking about something." What's that? I think maybe I used to think nobody really saw me, like I was just kind of there. And now I think somebody did. You did. For a long time. I kept my voice steady. I always saw you, I said. Right from the beginning. You were never hard to see. A pause. I know, he said quietly. I think that's why I always felt safe here. There is no perfect ending here. Because life doesn't run on perfect endings. Daniel is not the father he should have been for Ethan's first 9 years, and that time belongs to Ethan to make of what he will. Gwen is building something different, slowly, with both her sons. Connor and Ethan have, unexpectedly, become close the way brothers sometimes do when the pressure valve is released and they're allowed to be actual people with each other. And I still keep his cereal in my pantry, and his toothbrush in the guest bathroom, and my entire evening schedule arranged around phone calls from a kid who never should have had to wonder whether someone was glad he was there. He always had a place here. He just needed someone to say it out loud. Thanks for watching. Stay with us for the next one, and never stop choosing the people who need you most.